So I want to speak of how the great upheavals that occurred during the first half of the 20th century directly affected the artistic lives of my generation of musicians in the US. The vast majority of talented American musicians from previous generations would go to Europe to study. There were almost no major American performing artists. In fact, most of the first group of world-class American composers studied in Paris with Nadia Boulanger. The musicians in our orchestras were in large numbers from Europe. I was told, this is before my time, that the languages used at rehearsals were usually German or Russian, sometimes, especially with woodwind players, German, Italian or French. Okay, then came the Russian Revolution, which caused many major performers and composers to leave. Most ended up in the US. Then the Depression, which was even worse in Germany than in the US, and the coming of fascism, which caused a flood of major figures to come, some to flee, to the US. By the way, this morning I had breakfast, and Eduardo Delgado, we were talking a little bit about this, and he mentioned that in Argentina, there was also an influx of such people, and later as well. And I know myself that Cuba, Mexico also received quite a number. But the flood really came to the United States. Most of the new arrivals settled in the region between Washington and Boston, especially New York. Another group, made largely of composers, went to the Los Angeles area. This meant that my generation of young musicians, mainly because of the Russian Revolution and around a decade later, Adolf Hitler, we had, just around the time we were starting our studies, living right next to us. In my case, some of them within walking distance. Pianists like Hoffman, Godowsky, Moritz Rosenthal, Joseph Levine, Rachmaninoff, Horowitz, Schnabel, Rubinstein, Serkin, harpsichordist van der Landowska, violinists, Heifetz, Elman, Zimbalist, Chrysler, Milstein, Adolf Busch, Sigeti, Simon Goldberg, cellist, Piatigorsky, Emanuel Feuermann. Listen to these conductors: Toscanini, Kusevitsky, Stokowski, Fritz Reiner, George Zell, Bruno Walter, Pierre Monteux, Ormandy, William Steinberg, Eric Leinsdorf. Composers: Schoenberg, Stravinsky, Bartok, Hindemith. The vast majority of these people would never have been ever living in the United States if it were not for these upheavals. They would come and tour, conduct an orchestra, give concerts, stay a while, but their homes would always be somewhere where they came from originally in Europe. They were all, many of these people, when I would take a walk on the street, I saw Rachmaninoff a few times because he lived 3 blocks where I did. Horowitz was, I got to know him later, but when I was a child, he was within also walking distance, many of these people. This was a totally unprecedented situation. Until then, talented young students from anywhere, everywhere in the world, would come to study in some European center, most often Germany and Austria, or in Russia, in St. Petersburg and Moscow. These students would receive over 90% of their musical influences from teachers who were themselves trained mostly in the same tradition. Now there was, in a few areas of one country, unlimited possibilities of cross-pollination. Okay, now I'll get personal. My father was a violinist who, at the age of 14, was accepted by the St. Petersburg Conservatory to study with Leopold Auer. Auer is considered one of the greatest violin teachers ever. By the way, Heifetz, Elman, Zimbalist were studying with him at the same time as my father. My father arrived in the US in the early 1920s. His first job was as concertmaster of the Minneapolis Orchestra. A few years later, he received a letter from his old teacher, from Auer, who had just left the Soviet Union and was in Stockholm. Auer wrote that he was about to come to live in New York and was wondering whether my father would be interested in joining him as his assistant. So that is how my father ended up in New York. And that is how I, the son of a St. Petersburg trained violinist, ended up studying from the age of 7 to 17 with Isabella Vingerova, who had been a student of Theodor Listitsky at the St. Petersburg Conservatory. However, excuse me, one of my very best friends in New York was studying with Sirkin, another with Schnabel. I myself, in my late teens, after Curtis, and early 20s, studied with Horowitz and with Sirkin. My friends and I played for and criticized each other incessantly, discussing, arguing, attending concerts given by all those great people mentioned earlier, and many, many more who were constantly arriving during that period of history. Now I will skip to a description of the school that has been such an important part of my life. I had mentioned that I had studied for 10 years from the age of 7 to 17 with Isabel Vingerova, who was a product of the St. Petersburg Conservatory. This school I'm talking about is the Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia. During the first years of its existence, 90 years ago, it was sometimes known as the St. Petersburg Conservatory in Exile, because so many Curtis faculty were previously in St. Petersburg. Here's, in a highly abbreviated description, how this school came into existence. A very wealthy gentleman, Cyrus Curtis, who owned some of the most popular magazines in the United States, had a daughter who was deeply involved in the arts, especially music. They were very close to Leopold Stokowski, who was then the conductor of the Philadelphia Orchestra. They were also friends with Joseph Hoffman, one of the most esteemed pianists of that era. Stokowski wanted eventually to have a source of American musicians trained in America for his orchestra. And Hoffman wanted that America should have an elite small conservatory. Hoffman agreed to become director of such an establishment, and Stokowski agreed to become intimately involved with the orchestra such a school would have, provided that it would be small, geared to very young students, and most important, would be completely free. The daughter of Mr. Curtis gave $12 million, which 90 years ago was considered a good sum of money. It was so much at that time, it seemed like so much, that Curtis would never have any financial problems, even though there was no money coming in from the students. I started to teach at Curtis in 1981 and became director and then later president. I became director in 1986. By then, the endowment had grown to $50 million. I was president for 20 years, and by 2006, the endowment was around $175 million. And we usually only had about 165 students. In fact, when they found out about it, some of these members of the student council suggested that we could give each student $1 million and still have $10 million left over for the school. Anyway, this only 165 students, enough for an orchestra, plus around 20 singers, 20 pianists, around 4 composers, 4 conductors. However, the Curtis impact on the world of music is totally out of proportion to its size. Over half of the Philadelphia Orchestra is made up of Curtis graduates. In fact, I signed many of their diplomas, as are a disproportionate number of principal orchestra players in the major orchestras. The Met and other major opera companies are well represented by our singers, and of course, so many of our alumni have major solo careers. And remember again how small Curtis is. A maximum of 20 piano students, for example. Most other major conservatories have several hundred piano students. 3 alumni of Curtis are represented as jurors in the Top of the World competition. Besides myself, there's Li Jian, who graduated, I think, around 1990. He can correct me if I'm wrong, because he's here. 90, correct? He studied with the legendary Mieczyslaw Herzowski. I think he was in his 90s at the time that Li Jian was studying with him. And Herzowski taught at Curtis till shortly before he died at the age of 101. And Ignat Solzhenitsyn, who graduated, he told me, in 1995 with degrees in both piano and conducting. Most of the applicants for Curtis, especially in piano and strings, at the time that I started to study there, were second-generation youngsters from Eastern and Central Europe for the reasons described earlier. Now, the vast majority come from Asia. Although I'm no longer involved in the running of the school, I continue to teach there, and now have 6 students, twice as many as before. Their ages are, 2 of them are 14, 2 are 16, 1 is 19, and 1 is 20. 3 are Chinese, 2 are American-born Chinese, and 1 is from Indonesia. So that is how things have changed there. So I am open to questions, which I may or may not be able to answer properly, but I will try. No questions?
Well, I would like to ask maybe a question, because I have been always very concerned about the young generation of pianists and good musicians that are in the world. And as you know, when I being here in this wonderful competition, in this wonderful environment, and meeting wonderful musicians, I go back to my younger years, and I remember the struggle that I went through myself. Somehow, our generation made it somehow in having a career and a teaching position and concertizing. But sometimes I wonder what is going to happen to the new talents that we have now. You know, we listen to, in this competition, to very fine, young talent pianists that sometimes I'm concerned about their future, because they have been working so hard and studying so hard and financially struggling so much to go from competition to competition and making expenses, you know, and I feel that they are probably at a point in their life that they feel, what now? You know?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's no real answer. The point is there are more, especially now with Asia coming in, there are more big talents in numbers than there ever were. And there are people who deserve to have careers who won't have careers. Yeah. That's life. I mean, that's absolutely true. And you can still make a fulfilling life in music in many different ways. And things are different now in a way better than before. For example, going back to my father's time, in Russia, before the revolution, the St. Petersburg Conservatory, a violinist who, you know, was beginning to play very well and needed to get his first easy concerto would be Mozart's. Then he would graduate and play Wieniawski eventually. It was that kind of attitude. Chamber music was for those who could not, well, orchestra playing who couldn't definitely be soloists ever. Chamber music was at one higher level. If you were a chamber musician, that means you really weren't a soloist. Well, that's, of course, not the situation now. Quite the opposite. I mean, something, well, you know that. It was, by the way, when China woke up after the Second World War, before the Cultural Revolution, had that attitude too. And even after the Cultural Revolution, when things began, when the schools started to reopen, it was still that old tradition, because the Russians had sent artists, dancers, opera singers, scientists to China immediately after the Second World War, because they were allies, to start. It was the old Soviet thing, and I noticed until recently, it's better now, Chinese students auditioning at Curtis, the biggest talents and the lesser talents. They had one thing in common: they'd never played chamber music, ever. It wasn't taught in China. I mean, that was lower class. That's not the case now. So there are more possibilities in certain ways, but there are more people. And then there are economic things going on. Well, I know better in the United States. Many orchestras are having serious problems. The orchestra players are very well paid, extremely well paid in the States, which was not the case when I was beginning to play. There was no orchestra in America that played 52 weeks a year or was paid 52 weeks a year. Not one, not even Philadelphia or Boston. And then eventually, because of Tanglewood, I think the Boston got a contract for 52. But musicians were paid sort of lower middle class fees, salaries, and would supplement it to make it middle class rather than lower middle class by going in the summer to music camps or playing in some pops orchestra in the summer, or playing in Broadway theaters, by the way, which paid better, and teaching, of course. So, although that's another thing, I'm sort of a maverick there because I'm older. That's why everybody's complaining about. It's a little bit like complaining of buying a stock on the New York Stock Exchange for, I don't know, $10, and it goes up to 100. And then there's a disaster and it goes down to 50. And you think, my God, this is the end of the world. But you only pay 10 for it in the first place. Okay, so there were very few orchestras, as I said, that played more than 26 weeks. Orchestras like St. Louis, 26, 25 weeks. They played usually one or two concerts each series of concerts. Now they play 3 or 4. And now it went back a certain percent, but it's still very much more than what was before. That doesn't completely answer your question, because there always will be some very big talents, but there are can be mitigating circumstances. There was, I remember, a violinist at Curtis before my time who was considered, he was going to be, one of the great. He just didn't play his best in front of a large audience. But sitting in a room with a few people or making a record, except they didn't make many records at that time, he was fantastic. Well, that was a special thing. Contests aren't the only thing. Many, especially the young ones, have started. Well, in my students, Lang came to Curtis when he was 13. He had been to 1 million competitions in China, because China, everything is a competition in China. You have to be, number 2 is no good, you have to be number 1. When you talk about Chinese painters of the, early Ming Dynasty, they say, well, number 1 was so-and-so, and then there were a few other good ones. You would never say this about the French Impressionists, saying that Monet was number 1, but Renoir, etc. It's a mentality. It is a competition mentality. And Yuja Wang came when she was 15. Once they came to Curtis, I didn't allow them to go to any competition. And they managed perfectly well without it. On the other hand, Zhang Haochen, who won the gold medal in Clyburn 3 years ago, became 18, I think, and everybody said he was wonderful, but nobody was interested in him. Managers heard him, or conductors heard him. Conductors would say, oh, I want to hear him in 2 years, and, maybe we'll fit him in somewhere. Managers said we had too many pianists, and they always say that. So he went. He had no choice. He went, and he was lucky. And that's luck, too. Sure, he played well, but it's also luck. He could very well have not gotten to the finals and played just as well. That happens all the time. So each career is done differently. There's no magic formula that fits everybody. And maybe now that China is not just exporting everybody to study, they're gradually having better orchestras. They still don't pay them very well. And they have, in the Financial Times, there was an article about 6 months ago that there were 50 million Chinese kids studying piano, which means there probably were another 50 million studying all the stringed instruments. And God knows how many girls were, especially girls in China rather than boys, were in ballet. And I know many Chinese singers. So, you're dealing with over 100 million young people who are not going to make a career in music, obviously, but are going to make a potential audience for the next generation. They will know something about music. And the very small percentage of them who will be continuing on will have an audience. And it's a country of 1.3 billion people. And, Li Zhen knows more than I do about all of this, but eventually they will have to have major orchestras in every city that has more than 5 million or something population. There are very many cities of more than 5 million in China. So that will be another source for career. In fact, it's getting that way a little bit now already. Europe is going through, not Norway, I'm told, but most of Europe is going through bad financial time now. These things go in cycles, and so the government is cutting back on partially subsidizing opera houses and symphonies. This will pass too. Right. Okay, any other question?
Would you be so kind to say a few words about your study with Horowitz and with Horowitz?
Oh, yeah, sure.
And how this study influenced your own playing
Yeah, it did.
and your own way of teaching?
Yeah, the teaching, it influenced the teaching even more in a way. Yeah. Yes, it's a good. Vingerova, my teacher at Curtis for 10 years, was very close to Horowitz. And those years also, when you played with orchestras in America, almost every major orchestra, but even many of the others, had a weekly radio broadcast. There was a lot more available than now. And Horowitz, therefore, had heard me quite a number of times playing with orchestras. I didn't even know about it, but he told Vingerova. He told Vingerova that this was one of the periods that he stopped playing. There were several periods in his life. He just was not giving concerts anymore. And that he would have time, and that if I wanted to play for him, he would be, he didn't say to teach me, but just to come over and play for him. He would be receptive. Well, obviously, she gave me his phone number, and 5 minutes later, or anyway, the next day, I called him. And came over. We discussed some things that he had heard me play. And then I played for him. And he said to me, let's see, several things, that, the kind of pedaling you use works perfectly in, not a room this size, in a living room. But as soon as you're in a bigger hall, it'll be too dry. You have to think of that, It's, well, I never thought, okay. Then, and this was much more important, he said, Chopin G minor ballade is one of the things I played. How would you sing this? Seem, you know, I don't know how to sing. Okay, so I said I don't know how to sing. He said, that's not the point. So said, you're phrasing it differently when you sing it. And you're breathing in a certain place why they're not here. And that started to think. And he sent me home, lending me some bel canto, the 78 RPM records, it's before LP, of Battistini, who was a great bel canto singer, and a recording of Pique Dame, the Queen of Spades, the opera by Tchaikovsky. Okay, so, and he said, you know, I could come next week and play for him. And anyway, it developed into my playing for him maybe once a week for a year, and once a month for 3 or 4 years after that. And speaking to him on the phone every day, because he liked to gossip. And he was not only not giving concerts, he was not going out. Practically, he lived half a block from Central Park, if you know New York. So he would walk into the park for half an hour. That was the extent of it. So wait, but there are many things here that I'll come to. He ended up criticizing me on usually what he thought I was trying to get to accomplish and not succeeding in my thing. Not that he wouldn't jump to the piano and say, no, I do it this way. It was very seldom, this happened, but very seldom did he say, I think you're completely on the wrong track. Never, almost never. It happened once with the Chopin mazurka, and more than that too. But usually it was, I see what you're driving at, but it would be more convincing maybe. And that answers the business of teaching. I have no method. Well, I only started, there was one girl who studied with me when she was 10 years old, before I was 50 years old. But I only started to teach when I was 50 years old, really, except for this one person. I don't have any method. Rubinstein played high chair, very high, round fingers. Horowitz played very low, flat fingers. They both played perfectly well, in their own way. So I didn't, never really believed in method. Vingerova, my teacher, of course, did have the Leschetizky method, which was more round fingers, and mainly thinking of beautiful, beautiful sounds. And I remember she yelled at me once that, when I was playing something with flat fingers, and said, Horowitz can do it, but you can't. Something like that. Yeah. And then complained that I was imitating, this was still when I was with her, imitating Rudolf Serkin, because I was getting all excited and stamping my foot very loudly, because he did sometimes, so it influenced many of his students, as a matter of fact. But another thing with Horowitz, very important, although he was not giving concerts, he was recording. They would, of course, they wanted him to make many records, naturally. He couldn't decide. He was going to make a Clementi, I remember, Clementi sonatas. So by then you had LPs, okay? And you could get, if they're short, 4 sonatas, probably 3 on an LP. He couldn't decide. He played for me during a period of, 3, 4 months, maybe 10, 12 Clementi sonatas. Not that he wanted my advice, but just for himself to play it through, to feel which he really wanted to record. So he used me in a wonderful way with Scarlatti sonatas also. He played God knows how many Scarlatti sonatas just to make one LP, but he played enough for 5 LPs. Then he would play, all the time saying that, of course, he can't play anymore because he wasn't giving concerts, things that I didn't know. He, at one point, you remember, I was still like 20 years old. I knew some of these Scriabin sonatas, but when he mentioned the sixth, I didn't know the sixth. He said, but that's one of the most beautiful ones. I really can't play well anymore, he said. He went to the piano and played it through beautifully, you know. Okay. So that sort of, Mettner. Nobody played Mettner. Nobody still plays Mettner. He played, I don't know how many pieces of his. He was a night person, and I am too. So I would usually come at 8 o'clock, and he would work with me until 10. Then we would talk, and then he would end up going to the piano, and I would, until his wife kicked me out at 1 in the morning after bringing us some food to eat. This was a fantastic experience. With Sherkin, it was on a different kind of situation. I knew him personally, even called him by his first name when I was very young, because he told me to. And he was teaching at Curtis, but I was studying with, Vingerva. And he started the Marlborough School, which is maybe unique in the world. I mean, it's the top of what it does. It's only chamber music. And it started in 1951, I think, because I came in 52. Yes. It started in 51. And in 52 and 53, I was there. And it wasn't as organized as it is now. There were fewer people, actually, and they hadn't completely decided the format and everything to my advantage, because I ended up playing for him 5 or 6 days a week. It was almost all chamber music, although since I had a recital coming up, as soon Marlborough was over, he did let me play. I don't think that's done anymore. Is it, Ignat? Does anybody play? Yeah, it's forbidden. Yeah. I remember playing a recital that I was going to play in Carnegie Hall like 2 weeks or 3 weeks into September, playing it through there. But the amount of chamber music that I worked on with him was incredible. So I was very lucky in that situation. Okay, anything else? Some of the young people, or I'm going to say some of the young people in the back. Okay, well, yeah, all right, yeah.
One more question for me. When you look at your definitely huge repertoire list, right? Building up this repertoire list, probably as with almost all of people, the biggest part was built up in the younger years.
Yes.
But you still, during your
Yes,
career,
yes.
you learn new pieces.
You have to.
How your habits to learn new pieces
It
changed through years?
Okay, some people learn faster than others. The two Chinese, all three, actually, Hao Chen also, all three of them, Hao Chen, Yuja, and Langang, they can learn. In fact, I discussed this with Leon Fleischer recently, who was almost exactly my age. And we've been close friends always, I mean, since we're teenagers, that these kids seem to learn faster. Not just in a facile way, but to really give a decent performance of something, let's say in 2 weeks, that we would spend 6 weeks on maybe. So some people learn faster than others. It doesn't mean when you walk out in Carnegie Hall, nobody cares whether you spend 2 months or 2 years on what you're going to play. But if it's the lesser amount, you have an easier life, or you learn more repertoire, or you spend less time, or whatever. But you had to. I would play, from the age of about 20 to 50, I played about 100 concerts a year, which is no big deal now. I mean, the people I'm speaking about are playing more. And maybe they shouldn't, but they are. So I would come to Chicago and to play, let's say, with the orchestra, which means I'd be there for a week because it's several concerts and several rehearsals and maybe a run-out concert to Milwaukee. So the Steinway people there would let me have a studio in which I could practice all night if I wanted to, and I would. So I would not be playing my whatever concerto it was, and then I knew that a week later I was playing a recital of stuff that I had played a lot. But 3 weeks later, there was a work I'd only played once before and wasn't good. So I practiced. I mean, that's you just practice a lot. Yeah, depending on the amount of repertoire. So, but yes, the sort of the body, in fact, whenever I have a new student, and I, as I'm just having next year at Curtis, because there were a lot graduated this year, I ask them before they leave, or now with email and it's easy, to send me a list of all the repertoire they have studied. Well, including, this 14-year-old girl from Indonesia. That's something new at Curtis. We never had, I don't think we ever had, there were three, we had 130 applicants who played at Curtis, who came to play. 3 were from Indonesia, and we put about 20 or something of these 130 in the finals so we could listen to them at greater length. All 3 Indonesians were in the finals. Okay, so we took one of them, which a 14-year-old girl. So I asked her, as I asked the other people, what have you studied up to now? And you see strange things sometimes. You see no Mozart, or no Chopin or Schumann, but a lot of things on this side or on that side. So I assigned them over the summer, what I think they should work on, and then as I get to know them, of course, may have other ideas. So anyway, this Indonesian girl plays the Boulez Sonata, 14. It was in her repertoire. And I heard her play what we consider far-out things, and in fact, yeah, Ignat heard her too, because he was at the auditions. So anyway. Anybody from the back? Yeah.
On the idea, maybe it's strange that I asked, but the idea of competing in music.
The idea of what?
Competing. But if competitions, students who participate in a lot of competitions become different in the end than students who don't participate in so many competitions.
Well, since I don't know how a student who doesn't come to a competition would he change if he did? I don't know that. But as I said, it is one of the ways to get started. It's not the only way. If by the age of 20 or earlier, a manager gets interested in you and you begin to have concerts, then you don't have to go to a competition. So it's each case. I'm thinking aloud now of a pianist like Richard Good. You don't think of his playing, his personality, his very being, as being a competitor, of going to competitions. Yet his career wasn't, just everybody said how wonderful he was and how musical and how this, but not so many people engaged him. So he went to Geneva and entered the competition and was lucky and won it. So you don't think of Murray Pariah as a competition pianist. It's a way of getting started. If one is lucky, one already gets started before you but that doesn't happen very often. So, And each case is different, you know. About changing, maybe one just changes as one gets older. I mean, everybody does to some extent. You don't look as if I really answered your question.
Also, I have another question. I have this impression that the biggest,
The what?
the biggest pianists
Yeah.
with big careers, do you think they are happy?
But again, that you can't generalize. Some are suicidal, and some just love it. I mean, they. Lang Lang was playing. I don't think he should. And I told him that he's playing. I don't know, 150 concerts a year. He loves it. He just loves it. I mean, you know, that's fine. Others are, you know, each one, they get worried about it, and this and that, and external things happen, and personal things in your life, and so forth. So you can generalize. Horowitz, that comeback when he hadn't played all those years. Schuyler Chapin, who's a manager and everything in music, a record guy, and so forth, was with him, brought him to backstage Carnegie Hall, and according to Schuyler Chapin, Horowitz said, "I can't go out." I don't think he was being coy. I think he said, you know, I just can't go out. And when he was standing, and the door was open, and Schuyler pushed him. He was already in front of the audience. Yeah. Rubinstein loved it, I think. I mean, he's one generation more than me. So I knew him, but I didn't know him as a friend, a close friend. My opinion is that he just loved that life.
Did you have a chance to meet Rachmaninoff?
Yes, but then I was very young. In other words, I saw him on the street, as I mentioned before, because he lived near us. But I went to his Carnegie Hall concerts. But I was, wait, when did he die? You can figure. 43. What? 43. Well, no, 38. No, but it was only backstage. I would each time be reintroduced to him, and he, you know, would say, "Oh, you're studying at Curtis," or "What are you practicing?" Or, you know, that was, but not really, no.
Did you ever play with Toscanini?
With whom?
Toscanini.
No. Also before. Well, no, it could. I mean, like, you know, he could have engaged me when I was 16, but he didn't. But I had a connection with him, a very lucky one. One of my best friends, Toscanini lived just outside of Manhattan in a place called Riverdale. And one of my best friends lived also in Riverdale, and his parents were very close friends from Italy with Toscanini, very close. And Toscanini was at that time the conductor of the NBC orchestra, and nobody could come to the rehearsals without, you know, just like family or something. I had permission. So I would sit in on Toscanini rehearsals almost every week. So I think he may have seen that I was there, but I didn't know him.
So what did you learn from these rehearsals?
How do you put into words? I learned a great deal. I tell you, Toscanini influenced my generation very, very much, the generation of pianists. And certain violinists did too. No, I would go with the score, and no, it was fantastic. I was even at his house once in Riverdale because this friend of mine was invited for New Year's Eve party. And Toscanini, I guess he did notice me because Toscanini said, "Oh, you know, you're a friend who always comes to the rehearsals. Bring him over too if you want." So I remember. So I shook hands with him, but that's about it. Yeah, there was one when everybody had a little bit too much to drink. I remember Nathan Milstein, the violinist, who went upstairs somewhere and dressed up as a gypsy and came down playing the gypsy music on the violin with earrings and the whole thing. So.
One of the biggest celebrities today is your student, Graffman.
Okay.
And I'm just wonder, how did you work with him?
Well, as I said, he was 13. Well, even before that, here's what speaking of competitions, when he was, I guess, 12, he won the Tchaikovsky competition for young people, which that year was held in Japan, in Tokyo, I think. And on the finals or whatever it was, or as a result of winning, I don't know, he sent me a DVD, or no, a CD of the Chopin Second Concerto, which he played with a Russian orchestra. They used a Russian orchestra, and it was very beautiful. And it was obviously a big talent. And what surprised me was that I assumed that he never had played one note of chamber music, as I mentioned before, coming from China. And when I got to know him, I found that was true. He never had played chamber music. He was listening and looking at the appropriate places, at the conductor, and taking normal liberties, actually less than he does now, in this concerto, and which is, one says there's nothing for the orchestra to do, but to be with the pianist and to breathe and make the same kind of rubato and so forth is not so easy. And it worked beautifully, as if he had played chamber music. So I was very impressed by it. Anyway, I wrote back to him that, he said to me, so, thank you, I enjoyed it very much, but everybody has to come in person and audition. And he then wrote me again that, yes, I know, and I'm coming, but included in this, the 24 Chopin Etudes. And they were, not all, in my opinion, but most of them were amazing. The lyrical ones, I thought he was excessive in certain ways, and well, that's the way he feels things, and so forth. And his first year at Curtis, second year, he played, I thought, a very convincing Schumann fantasy at the age of 14. It's quite very impressive. So it was right away that, and then people heard about this, and they would come to the student concerts. Managers came. I thought it was even too early to talk to conductors about him, but conductors asked me about him because they'd heard. So, but again, each case is different. And he had something else that you can't learn, no matter how talented you are. He had a kind of charisma with the audience. He just has it. Some people have it, some don't. Rudolf Serkin, in a way, didn't have it. In fact, when Serkin would walk out on stage, it looked as if the cleaning person, the janitor, accidentally walked on stage, Rubinstein, on the other hand, also.
Quite different question. Is it possible to explain in words the difference between different piano schools, piano method, the Russian school and so on?
That's a good question. Also, in the subject that I was talking about, very clearly there was let's say before the Russian Revolution, there was a Russian school and a German school and a French school, very, very clearly, and so forth. I first thought, I made my debut in London in the middle 50s. And I remember the critic started to write that there's nothing to do with whether he liked my playing or not, but about schools. He wrote about exactly what you're talking about, that there is now a Russian school, but I represented the old Russian school as differentiating. So he, took it even more. But what my point was that things are now all mixed up. And, as I say, I was studying with a Russian teacher. At that time, my two best friends were Leon Fleischer, who was studying with Schnabel, and Eugenie Stormin, who was studying with Sirkin. And this couldn't have happened before. So it is getting homogenized, which you could say is maybe not a good thing, but nevertheless, it is happening. It has happened, rather. So it's less clear now. It was clear before, or clearer.
Yeah, but talk about that a little more, because at the same time, when we look back, at least at the trees of piano parents and who studied with whom, then we see that, you mentioned Leschetizky. Well, it seems everybody studied with Leschetizky. Vingera studied with
Including Schnabel.
But Schnabel studied
Yeah.
with Leschetizky. Negaus, or Neuhaus, studied with Leschetizky, and so all of his people. So very quickly it goes back to, and of course everybody studied with Liszt, whether or not they studied with Leschetizky, it seems. And Czerny.
And Czerny, exactly, yes.
So where do you see, how does that bifurcate? You said it was more separate, and then it almost becomes, in our days, more mixed.
Well, but look, with Leopold-Auer, for example, and having high Fitz-Elman cymbalists who played completely differently, one from the other, but it was a different point of view, totally, than Adolf Busch or Sigeti, but totally different. In fact, opposed almost, in certain ways. In piano, I guess it was less pronounced, but I think that, and I don't have the details at all, that when Schnabel came to Leschetizky, wasn't he already a fully formed artist? I think, So it was, another, flourish of something. And, but that's, one should do, probably it's easy to do research on a thing like that. No, and many great composers who lived in Central Europe did visit St. Petersburg and, have performances and so forth. But it was sort of a little bit like somebody coming from outer space to spend 2 weeks there and then going back. And then life goes on. I don't know. Sure, a talented person got some idea that he didn't have before. I mean, we're all on the same planet, so naturally this kind of thing happens. But when Vingerova was studying, this was a Russian school in St. Petersburg, which may have been a little different than in Moscow, for that matter. But the idea of sound more than form in music, maybe that's part of it too. I mean, you need both, but maybe the Russians were more concerned with one, and the German school more with the other, maybe. And then you'll find, and I will too eventually, an exception to that. I don't know.
I don't remember, it was Horowitz who said there were actually only 2 piano schools, the good one and the bad one.
In the final analysis, yes. Well, that's with everything, yeah. Well, let's see what else. Touring has changed. In the old days, before my time, but just before my time, like 10 years before, maybe, if an artist went to Australia, you'd go for 2 months. You'd take a boat, usually. Not usually, you had to take a boat. Usually of a silent keyboard or something on it, although the boats had pianos and you were allowed to practice on it sometimes. And you'd play with the Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth, and a few other places, and spend, several times with the orchestra, 2 different concertos, in other words, a week apart, many recitals in each city, and come back 2 months later, exhausted, after not having good food, because the food was terrible then. Anyway, at my time, it was just beginning to change. We were flying on propeller planes. So it still was a long time. And what I would do, not that I had many, but the few times I went, since I'm interested in seeing different parts of the world, having nothing to do with playing concerts necessarily, on the way to Australia, I would tell the State Department in America that I'm available. They wanted artists, this is shortly after the Second World War, to play in remote, absolutely remote parts of the world. And I don't think they even paid a fee, or if they did, if they did, it was nothing to speak of. But they took care of, obviously, the hotel and all of that stuff. So in effect, I could have a mini vacation and try out the same programs, of course, that I had to be playing anyway. And so I remember once stopping first, in Istanbul, and flying from there to Beirut. The police in Beirut wanting, searched everything. And why did you come here now? Said, well, we have a reservation. I was with my wife at the St. George Hotel. Don't you know what's going on? Said, no, I don't know what's going on. Said, there's a revolution. So I said, I can't read Turkish. Yeah, that's the Turkish papers. They let us go to the hotel. I phoned a composer who I knew, who I'd met in Tanglewood, who said, what are you doing here? You've got to get out of here. And he walked he said, okay, go to bed, and I'll pick you up the next morning. He led us to the American embassy, which was a 10-minute walk. And one of the buildings was burning in the embassy. And we got to the cultural attaché, who was practically shaking with fear at this point. And everybody was looking at the ocean for the American fleet to come, which it did a few days later. The whole thing developed into nothing. There was no real, but it looked bad. Anyway, he said, you've got to get out of here. He picked up the phone and said, okay, you're on Iraq Airlines to Baghdad. So I said, my religion, I'm a Jew. I don't know if I should, I don't care what you are, he said. I don't want responsibility for you. Okay, we ended up in Baghdad. We had a wonderful time because we went, Baghdad is on the Tigris River, and Babylon was on the Euphrates River, not so far. So we got a car, and we saw the ruins of Babylon, and it was marvelous. And then went on to Karachi, eventually ending up in Peshawar, which is in Pakistan. And I was, for the State Department, going to play a concert in the capital of Afghanistan, Kabul. In fact, they liked me so much they re-engaged me. I played there twice. So you go through the Khyber Pass, which of course would be suicidal now. Peshawar, Kabul, except in your direction it's this way, over the Khyber Pass, and perfectly good Intercontinental Hotel, The concert was in a movie theater. The entire audience was made up of diplomatic people, very few from Afghanistan. So it was more for that reason. And the East German ambassador and the West German ambassador, who were at the party afterwards drinking beer together, having a good time in this remote part of the world. And I went to see what I wanted to see. I'm interested in Asian art. And then flew to Kathmandu from there. And this was typical, what I would do in order to get to Australia. Now, I did that every time I would go to Asia, and as well as Australia. And therefore I played in the early days in Kuala Lumpur and Singapore, and many times in Hong Kong. But in the early days, everybody plays in Hong Kong now, but in the early days, and use it as a mini vacation, really, before I would end up in Japan or Australia for a real tour. So, I mean, each person likes, where, you know, other colleagues of mine want to get it over with as quickly as possible, and we'll take the quickest way, let's say, to get to Australia and get out right away and come right back home. So it's just a different way of living.
Over the years, I've heard lots of musical jokes and all that, and also your experience with your 35 or 36 trips to China, and all those. Would you be able to share some of them with this audience?
You're right. It's about 36 times I've been to China.
Yeah, I counted.
Yeah, you've counted. Yeah, first time was in 1981. I would say maybe 10 of those were to give concerts, and the others were to explore. Even when I was director, those 20 years I was director in Curtis, at some point in middle of the winter, I would take off 3 weeks, and nothing to do with music, and just go to see some part of the world that I was interested to see. And not only China, so Burma, 3 weeks in Laos once. But in China, I would just take one of the provinces and explore. I knew what I wanted to see. You know, I planned ahead, of course. Tibet, of course, also. Xinjiang province of China. I was there twice. Once 3 years ago and once 23 years ago. And you've never been there? No. Yeah.
Well, Xinjiang is, but there's Tibet though.
No, because most of my Chinese friends have not been to 1/3 of the places that I've been. So, but I'm interested to see that.
What exactly did you do there?
I go to it started in 1981, as I said. Then it had to be in a group. Subsequently, I went alone. I preferred to go alone, but it had to be in a group. But the group was made up of museum curators from some prominent museums, and the Chinese department of Sotheby's auction house. They had, the curators, who of course were specialists, I'm not, had their specific things that they wanted to see, which I would never have known about, like in, I don't know, in Changsha, in Hunan province, at the museum, they have, but it's usually kept in the basement and not displayed, certain kinds of ceramics, certain paintings, certain sculptures. They know it's in that museum. Since these were important curators, they were delighted in Changsha to show it to us, which never would have happened if I would be there alone. But then later, as I got to know my way around a little bit, I was able to manage things like that.
You have lots of hobbies, I heard.
Well, Harbin is because of my father's connection. I've not been to Harbin. Excuse me. My father, I mentioned before that he studied with Auer. Well, in a little more detail. When two things happened. Just when he was to graduate as a violinist, director of the school, Glazunov was the director, called my father in and said, "Congratulations, Volodya, you've graduated. Next year you're going to study harp." And my father said, "I think you have me mixed up with another student." And he said, "You idiot. If you graduate, you go into the army." So he just stayed. But then the revolution was things were really falling apart, but not completely. It was announced that they wanted to, or the Tsar wanted to open a new music school in what was then the biggest city in Siberia, in Omsk. Now it's Novosibirsk, but at that time Omsk was the biggest city in population. And they wanted a young director of that school. So Glazunov asked my father, would he be interested? And, it seemed like, an adventure. So he went to Omsk, and he was saved all of the mess going on in the rest of Russia, because there was no shortage of food there. There was, at that time, no fighting whatsoever. He was able to send food to his mother and brothers. His father had died when he was very young. I think he was 10 or 12. So by now he was probably 18 or 19. And he had a younger brother and two younger sisters and a mother in Vilna, or Vilnius it's now. So he was able to send them food. And Vingerova, who became my teacher, remembers that he sent her a large piece of, cured meat or something that she couldn't get there. Anyway, there he was in Omsk, but eventually things were getting hot and heavy. And one of his sisters was a pianist, who studied also at the Conservatory in St. Petersburg, and as his accompanist, they started going west, and started going east, and playing in cities as they passed through, and including, by the way, Novosibirsk, which was called Novonikolaevsk at that time. And when I played in Novosibirsk, I played there twice. So the first time I was there, I was eating in the restaurant when an old man, who's probably younger than I am now, but he seems very old to me, with a huge white beard, practically down like that, who was the historian of the local museum, came very excitedly to see me and showed me a newspaper from Novonikolaevsk, almost exactly 50 years ago, about my father's recital in the same place where I was having dinner, which was the only stone building at that time. All the others were wood. So anyway, I'm making this much too long. He had a suitcase full of Russian rubles, thinking the revolution wouldn't last, so he had all these rubles, you see. Yeah. They were guaranteed by the Tsar in gold. Yeah. He eventually made his way and found himself in Harbin. Now, Harbin had become a Russian city by then, because there were many Russians going out of Russia. And they had an orchestra, almost 100% of Russian musicians. He became the concertmaster of the orchestra and also conducted it. Not that he was a conductor, but I don't quite understand this, but I saw because they sent me, information about programs and so forth. And he stayed there a few years, then went to Shanghai, lived, for those who know China, who lived in the Bund, which was where the foreigners lived in Shanghai, then Yokohama, where foreigners lived, then took a boat to San Francisco, and then was offered that job I mentioned to you as concertmaster of the Minneapolis Orchestra. So that's my connection with Harbin, and as a matter of fact, we're talking now with some people there about next time I'm in China, going to play there. But I've not been there.
How familiar are you with Norwegian music?
Well, I don't know Norwegian music except Greek. And of course, everybody knows, he's a very great composer. the Greek Concerto was probably the first romantic concerto that I played. Yeah, before I played Rachmaninoff or Tchaikovsky, I played Grieg. Yes. And I don't know what, there was some talk of my recording it with Ormandy, and I don't know what, this didn't work out, and then apparently there was, that I ended up recording with Cleveland instead that year. So, but there was some talk, because I played it many times, including with Philadelphia Orchestra. But, and the lyric pieces. In fact, one of you, I don't know, played some lyric pieces, very beautiful. I forgot. Gilels has a recording that I have of the lyric pieces.
Are you familiar with some?
I'm sorry?
Are you familiar with some Norwegian pianists?
Well, name me a few.
Well, probably the most famous one is Leif Ove Alsnes.
Yes, of course. Yes, I don't know him personally, but I've heard him. Yes. Mhm.
I think he plays a lot in America.
Yes, he does. He does. Yes, absolutely.
There's a saying now, it's a sort of half joke. In America, there are Russian Jewish teachers teaching Chinese how to play German music.
That's true. Well,
Yeah.
well, like me. Yeah. Except I was born in America, but still, yeah.
Yeah. What I like to see, also since I'm now working in Shanghai, is that Russian teachers teach Chinese how to play all sorts of music, but in China also. Because I have this theory that all of a sudden I understand that the Chinese, the Shanghai, for example, the conservatory was formed by Russian Jews.
Yes. Oh, yes.
1997.
Yes, I know that.
Thanks to the revolution.
Yeah, yeah,
October Revolution.
yeah.
And some of them, went to America.
Oh, there were many living there,
Yeah.
and actually, as difficult things were under the Japanese occupation, their lives were saved because they were there rather than in Germany.
So the first head of the piano department was a Russian, as a student of the third wife of Leschetizky.
The third wife, well, yeah, Yesipova. Well, Yesipova was which one? Because she was the famous one. Yesipova.
So
Yeah.
his name is Boris Sakharov, and he died there in 1934.
Uh-huh.
And he produced a lot of, a few very famous teachers, and became the real, teachers for the
Right.
next 30 years for the conservatory. And in 1950s, there were more Russian teachers right there.
Yeah, that's
And
right.
also, many of them went to Russia, to the Soviet Union to study, and so the blood was enriched. But every 30 years,
Right.
they would need a blood transfusion. But in the 80s, nothing went on. On the contrary, many people left Shanghai
Right.
for America, for a better life or something. So, so now they are employing people like me who studied and who have foreign passports to
Mm.
go there and study, to teach. But I have a philosophy. I said, why do you hire people like me? You should because you have to go through the same procedure like for a foreigner. You should just get Russian teachers to go there and teach. And that's how you get.
Well, yeah. The first time I was in China in '81, and it was, I told you, with a group of art historians and curators having nothing to do with music, I got a phone call from, you would remember his name, and I saw him again recently. He's still alive, and this is '81. He was the head of the Beijing Conservatory of Music.
Yes, Wu's father is Mr.
Wu, yeah, Wu, yeah.
Wu Zuqiang.
Yeah, and he, through an interpreter, asked if I would like to see the conservatory, because I had several days. I said, naturally. So there were no cars. Nobody had cars. at that time, except a car would be associated with the Conservatory of Music. So it was his car to use for business, but on a weekend he could not use that car to take his family, on an outing or something, not officially anyway. So anyway, drove and picked me up, and his English was even worse than my Chinese. And yeah, I speak a few words of Chinese, but I don't speak. So, I was struggling, and then I realized he was older than I was and probably studied in Russia. So I asked, he said, oh yes, I was. So I said, then you speak Russian? He said, yes. So from then on, everything was fine. So anyway, then stories like what you're talking about. I remember in Hanoi being taken to the conservatory. Almost all the teachers spoke Russian. Almost all. They were either Russian or they were Russian trained. So, and this is not that long ago.
So we are planning to have at least 2 Russian teachers, real Russian teachers, no matter where they're from, but the group has to be from there, to teach in the Shanghai Conservatory. We're planning to have that in the next year or 2.
Okay.
And not for master classes, because we have had lots of master classes, and people come and talk for 2 or 3 sessions, and they talk about music and all that, but very few people have the time and the energy to tell them what's wrong, because most of them have something wrong, the students, technically speaking.
Mm-hmm.
So we want teachers to go there and teach for 5 years or so, at least, and be responsible for 10 to 12 students, and to really produce the next generation of pianists before they get
Right.
go to the West and do something.
Mm-hmm.
And continue their study and all that. And I think we can do that, but we cannot do that without, it's like, I call it the chicken soup, that the first day is great, and the second day there are less water, so we have to start adding water, and the third day with SMG, and it becomes artificial. And the same in China, definitely. So.
So, any?
We
Okay.
have almost reached the time for we had foreseen. So if there's no other questions, I think we say thank you very, very much.
You are very good. Thank you. Thank you.